The moment Louise Holloway pushed open the door of the Redrock Assay Office, the little brass bell above the frame gave a sound so sharp and clear that every man in the room turned to look at her, and not a single one of them knew what she was carrying in the worn leather pouch pressed against her chest. It was the spring of 1879, and the town of Redrock, Nevada, was the kind of place that grew up fast and loud around silver and copper, a boomtown perched at the edge of a canyon where the wind came down from the hills in the afternoon and swept dust through every open door. The main street was wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without trouble, and it was lined with the usual assortment of establishments that attached themselves to mining wealth, the way barnacles attached themselves to river pilings. There was a general store, a hotel of middling reputation, a saloon called the Copper Crown that never seemed to close, a land office, and right at the north end of the strip, set slightly back from the road as if it wanted a little privacy from its neighbors, the Redrock Assay Office, with its freshly painted sign and its single front window through which the late morning sun fell in a long rectangle across the counter. Louise was 31 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept in a practical knot at the back of her neck, green eyes that had a way of holding steady on a person, even when that person would rather look away, and the kind of face that had been pretty before grief got at it and was still pretty now, just differently so, with a new seriousness around the mouth and a watchfulness in the eyes that had not been there before. She was dressed in her second-best dress because her best dress was still black with mourning, and she had decided that morning, deliberately and with some effort, that she was not going to walk into a business establishment wearing a flag of grief if she could help it. The dress she wore was a deep blue-gray wool, and it was clean and well-mended, and she held herself straight in it as she crossed the threshold. The office was not large. There were shelves along one wall stacked with ledgers and bottles of chemical reagents, a heavy iron scale bolted to a work table on the right side, a second table with a furnace that was presently cold, and at the far end of the room, a wooden counter behind which a man sat on a stool, bent over something he was examining through a small loupe. He did not look up immediately when the bell rang, because the bell had rung for someone else a moment before, and he had already acknowledged that customer, a barrel-chested prospector named Duggan who was leaning against the left wall waiting for his results. Louise stepped up to the counter and waited. The man behind the counter straightened slowly, set down the loupe, and looked at her. His name was Cecil Norris, and he was 34 years old, and he had been running this assay office for 3 years since coming out from Philadelphia, where he had studied mineralogy and chemistry at the Franklin Institute, and then spent 2 years working in the mint. He was not what people generally pictured when they thought of Assiers in boomtowns. He was not grizzled or sun-hardened. He was lean, of medium height, with brown hair that was beginning to show a little silver at the temples, though he was not yet old enough to have earned it by years, with dark gray eyes behind round wire spectacles, and hands that were permanently stained at the fingertips from the acids and chemicals of his work, no matter how hard he scrubbed them. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, a leather apron, and a quiet, careful expression that people sometimes mistook for coldness until they spoke to him long enough to understand that it was simply concentration, that he was a man who paid attention. He paid attention now. "Good morning," he said. His voice was level and unhurried. "What can I do for you?" Louise set the leather pouch on the counter. She did not explain anything yet. She loosened the drawstring with fingers that were steadier than she expected them to be and turned the pouch over and let the contents slide out onto the wooden surface. It was a sample of ore. A rough piece of quartz about the size of a fist, with visible metallic inclusions that caught the light in a way that made Duggan, still waiting against the wall, crane his neck despite himself. There were also 4 smaller chips of similar material, which had been wrapped separately in a piece of cloth. Cecil Norris looked at the rock. He did not touch it immediately. He leaned forward slightly and his eyes moved across the surface of the piece in a methodical way, and Louise watched his face and tried to read it and could not. "My husband brought this in from the North Canyon," she said. "From a claim he staked last October. He was meaning to bring it to you himself. He never got the chance." The words settled in the room. Duggan stopped craning his neck. Cecil Norris looked up from the rock and met her eyes, and what passed between them in that moment was not romantic, not yet. It was simply the recognition of a loss, one human being acknowledging the grief of another without making a show of it. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he meant it without ceremony. "Thank you," Louise said. "His name was Thomas Holloway. He passed 6 weeks ago. Fever." Cecil nodded once. He pulled on a pair of cotton gloves and lifted the main piece of the sample, turned it, tilted it under the window light. He picked up a hand lens from the counter beside him and examined the metallic inclusions more closely, and as he did, a line appeared between his brows that might have been concentration or might have been something else. "Did he describe the location to you in any detail?" Cecil asked without looking up. "The geology of the site, whether there was any country rock, whether the vein was running east-west or north." "He said the vein was running along the north face of the upper canyon wall," Louise said. "He said it went deep. He had a map. I brought it." She reached into the same leather pouch and produced a folded piece of paper, which she smoothed carefully on the counter. Cecil set down the ore sample and looked at the map. It was drawn in pencil, the lines uncertain in places, the landmarks labeled in a cramped hand. He studied it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Mrs. Holloway, I'm going to need to run a proper assay on this. It'll take until tomorrow morning." "How much will that cost?" he told her. She counted it out from a small coin purse and set it on the counter. He wrote her a receipt in a clean, precise hand. "Come back tomorrow at 9, he said. She picked up the empty leather pouch. She looked at the piece of ore still sitting on the counter, and for a moment something crossed her face that was equal parts hope and dread, as though she was afraid to want too much from it and afraid not to want enough. Then she straightened, folded the map, and left it on the counter as he had indicated. "Thank you, Mr. Norris," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," he said. She turned and walked out, and the bell rang again over the door, and the rectangle of sunlight fell back into its place on the counter, and Cecil Norris stood for a moment with the ore sample in his gloved hand, looking at the door through which she had gone. Then he looked back at the rock. He knew what it was. He had known within the first 30 seconds of examining it, though he had given nothing away and would not until the assay was complete, and he had numbers to put behind the knowledge. But he recognized the formation, the quartz matrix, the particular sulfide inclusions, the way the metallic threads ran through the stone not in scattered flecks, but in concentrated veins that suggested depth and continuity rather than surface scatter. Thomas Holloway, whoever he had been, had found something significant in that North Canyon. Possibly very significant. And Thomas Holloway was dead, and his wife had come in alone with a leather pouch and steady hands and eyes that did not flinch. Cecil set the sample carefully on the work tray and began his preliminary preparation. Duggan, still waiting against the wall, said, "That widow's sample any good?" Cecil did not look at him. "I won't have results until tomorrow," he said, and the tone of his voice closed the subject with such finality that Duggan did not ask again. That night Cecil worked later than usual. He did his normal day's paperwork first, entered the results for 3 other customers in the ledger, cleaned his instruments, and then sat down at his desk in the back room where he kept a small stove and a chair and a shelf of books that had traveled with him from Philadelphia and were the only things in his life in Redrock that he would describe as irreplaceable. He ate a cold supper of bread and salt pork that he had brought from the hotel dining room that morning, and he drank a cup of strong coffee, and he read for an hour. But he could not concentrate on the page the way he normally could, and eventually he admitted to himself that he was thinking about the assay, and he got up and went back to the workroom and ran the first of the preliminary chemical tests by lamplight. The numbers that began to emerge were consistent with what his eye had already told him. He wrote them down in the margin of the worksheet and stared at them for a while. Louise Holloway was a widow with a claim she did not know how to work. In a town where the mining companies had lawyers and surveyors and capital, and had already begun the process, quiet and methodical and inevitable, of absorbing smaller claims by purchase or pressure or both. He knew this because it was his business to know the mineralogical landscape of the region, which meant knowing whose ground was worth what. And the North Canyon had been an area of interest for at least two of the larger operations for the past year. He had seen the surveyors, and he had heard things at the Copper Crown, which he visited perhaps twice a week for a meal when the hotel dining room was closed, and he had his own views about what was under that ground. He set down his pen and looked at the lamp flame for a moment. Then he made himself a second cup of coffee, which he knew was a mistake for sleeping, and drank it anyway, and finished the preliminary work, and locked up the office, and walked the 3 blocks to his room at the Redrock Hotel through air that smelled of sage and coal dust and the distant tang of the smelter that ran a mile east of town. The hotel was a 2-story wood frame building, and his room was on the 2nd floor at the back, away from the street. He lay on the bed without undressing for a while, looking at the ceiling, and thought about a woman with green eyes and a leather pouch and a dead man's map, and the particular kind of courage it took to walk into a room full of strangers carrying your last hope and keep your voice level while you set it on the counter. He thought about that for a long time before he slept. Louise, for her part, had gone from the assay office back to the boarding house where she was staying, a place called Calloway's on the south end of town, run by a widow named Martha Calloway who had 4 boarders and a vegetable garden, and a disposition that was practical and kind in equal measure. Louise had been at Calloway's for 3 weeks. She had arrived from the homestead out on the flat, 12 miles east of town, after deciding that she could not stay there alone through the spring with a dead husband, and a set of mining claims she did not understand, and no income beyond the small amount of cash Thomas had kept in the tin box under the floorboards in the kitchen, which had been less than she had hoped. She had made the decision to come to Redrock with characteristic practicality. She had locked the homestead, loaded a single trunk and 2 bags into the wagon, and driven herself to town on a bright cold morning when the desert was still white with frost in the shadows. She had taken a room at Calloway's, which she could afford for perhaps 2 more months, and she had begun the process of understanding her situation. Her situation was this. Thomas had staked 3 mining claims in the North Canyon area before he died. He had done the initial filing with the land office, and the paperwork was in order. She had checked, which was fortunate since Thomas had not been the most organized man in the world. He had spent the fall doing preliminary excavation work on the most promising of the 3 sites, which he called simply the main claim in his notes, and had pulled out a quantity of ore samples which he had intended to have assayed but had not gotten around to before the fever took him. The sample she had brought to Cecil Norris was from the main claim. The other 2 claims were less developed, and from what she could understand from Thomas's notes, less promising. She had also received, in the 3 weeks since arriving in Redrock, 2 visits from men who wanted to buy the claims. The first had been a representative of the Nevada Consolidated Mining Company, a smooth-spoken man in a city suit named Mr. Aldrich, who had offered her $400 for all 3 claims, and had implied, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that the offer was generous and temporary. The second had been a man named Holt who worked for himself, or said he did, a tall man with a reddish beard who had come to the boarding house door and made an offer of $350 in cash on the spot, and had seemed surprised and then annoyed when she declined. Louise had not declined out of stubbornness or sentimentality. She had declined because Thomas had believed in those claims enough to spend 6 months of hard labor on them before the fever took him, and she was not going to sell something she did not yet know the value of. She was not a fool, and she was not a romantic, and she understood that she was a woman alone in a mining town in 1879, Nevada, with limited resources and no particular allies. But she had also learned from 20 years of living that the first offer was rarely the best one. So she had come to the assay office. That evening at Calloway's, she sat at the table in the dining room after supper and helped Martha with the mending while the other boarders, two miners and a traveling hardware salesman named Greaves, played cards in the parlor. Martha was a stout woman of 50 with iron-gray hair and an excellent memory for every piece of gossip that had circulated through Redrock in the past decade. She knew everyone. "You said you went to the assay office today," Martha said, biting off a thread. "Who'd you see?" "Cecil." "A man named Cecil Norris," Louise said. "Yes." Martha smiled at her mending. "He's a good man, Cecil, been here since '76, honest as the day. Won't cook the numbers for you, which some of those boys will do if you catch them in the right mood, but he won't cook them against you either, which matters more." She paused. "Smart, peculiar hours. I see his light on at 2 in the morning sometimes when I can't sleep. He's always working on something." "He seemed thorough," Louise said. "He is. And he's fair, which is more than I can say for Denny Harper over at the old assay shack by the mill, who will tell you your ore is worthless if someone with deeper pockets has asked him to say so." Martha gave her a level look. "You should trust what Cecil tells you." "I plan to," Louise said. She went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about Thomas, which she did every night, a habit of grief that she suspected would be with her for a long time. She thought about the way he had looked in the lamplight the last night he had been well enough to talk, describing the North Canyon in terms that were almost reverent, the way the rock formation broke along the face, the deep crack in the upper wall where the vein appeared, the particular color of the inclusions that he was sure, he was certain, were the real thing. He had been so alive in that telling, his eyes bright with it, and 2 weeks later he was gone. The fever had come hard and fast, and the doctor in town had been out on a house call 40 miles away, and by the time word reached anyone who could help it was too late. She did not let herself cry, because she had made a decision when she came to town that crying was for the night hours and the private room, not for the public daylight hours in which she needed to function, and she had been keeping to that agreement with herself. But she let herself think about him, which was different. She let herself remember his voice describing the canyon, and she thought, "I am going to find out what you found, Thomas. I am going to know whether it was worth what it cost." The next morning she was at the assay office at 9 o'clock exactly. Cecil Norris was already behind the counter when she came in, and he had a sheet of paper in front of him and a cup of coffee at his elbow, and he looked up when the bell rang with an expression that she could not quite categorize, something careful and measured but with an undercurrent of something that was almost, she thought, anticipation. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Good morning. Please sit down." He indicated the single wooden chair that stood on the customer's side of the counter, which she had not been offered the previous day. She sat. He looked at the paper in front of him, and then he looked at her, and he said, without preamble, "Your husband's claim is significant." She said nothing. She waited. "The sample he pulled from the main claim is high-grade silver ore," Cecil said. "The assay values are running at roughly 240 ounces of silver per ton of ore, and there is a secondary component of gold that brings the combined value considerably higher. For context, anything over 150 ounces per ton is considered excellent grade for this region. 240 is exceptional." The room was very quiet. Outside, a horse went past at a trot, and then the sound faded. "I want to be precise with you," Cecil continued, "because I think you need precise information rather than enthusiasm. This is a sample from one location in one tunnel on one claim. It tells us that the vein Thomas located is high-grade. It does not tell us how far the vein extends, how deep it runs, or what the ore looks like 50 feet from where this was pulled. Those are questions that require further development work and additional sampling. The value of your claim as of this morning, is therefore not a single number I can give you with confidence. What I can tell you is that the sample you brought me represents a discovery worth investigating seriously, and that the offer you may have received for your claims—" He stopped himself. Louise said, "You know about the offers." "I know Aldrich is buying up anything worth buying in the North Canyon region on behalf of Nevada Consolidated," Cecil said. "It's not a secret. I don't know what he offered you, and I'm not going to ask, but I would guess it was considerably less than what a properly developed and assayed property might actually be worth." $400, Louise said, "for all 3 claims." Cecil looked at the assay sheet. He looked at the numbers he had written there the night before. "Mrs. Holloway," he said carefully, "the main claim alone, if the vein continues with any consistency, is worth orders of magnitude more than $400. Louise exhaled slowly. She had known or hoped, but knowing and hearing the words spoken by someone with the knowledge to say them were 2 different things, and the difference hit her somewhere in the chest with a force that was half relief and half grief, because the thing Thomas had believed in was real, and he had not lived to see it confirmed. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then she said, "What do I do?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked a stranger, and she recognized as she said it that it was also the most vulnerable because it admitted that she did not know, and she was a woman who did not easily admit what she did not know. But Cecil Norris did not take advantage of the admission. He simply thought about the question seriously, as though it deserved serious thought, and then he said, "You have a few options, and I'll lay them out for you as plainly as I can," he told her. He was methodical and patient about it, going through each possibility, its advantages and its risks. She could sell the claims, and if she waited and got a better assessment of the vein's extent, she could negotiate a better price than what she had been offered. She could lease the claims to a mining company on a royalty arrangement, which would give her ongoing income proportional to production. She could hire a development crew and work the claims herself, which would require capital and management and carried more risk, but also more potential reward. Or she could bring in a partner, someone with the resources and experience to develop the property in exchange for a share of the proceeds. He laid it out clearly and without steering her toward any particular choice, and Louise listened carefully, and at the end of it she said, "Which would you do?" "That," he said, and there was a slight shift in his expression, something almost like a smile, "depends on things I don't know. It depends on whether you intend to stay in this region or whether you have family elsewhere. It depends on your financial situation and how long you can afford to be patient. It depends on your temperament." "I am patient," Louise said. "I do not have family elsewhere who need me. My financial situation is not good, but I have enough to last a couple of months. And my temperament," she paused. "My husband used to say I was the most stubborn woman he had ever met." This time Cecil did smile, briefly and genuinely. "Then I would say your options are wider than you might think." She left the assay office that morning with the written results folded in her purse and a great deal to think about. But before she left, she had asked one more question, which was whether Cecil Norris knew anyone reputable in Redrock who could give her an opinion on the development costs and logistics of working the main claim, and he had said yes. He knew a man, a mining engineer named Frank Purcell, who had worked for 2 of the larger Nevada operations and had recently set up independently, and that he would be glad to make an introduction if she wished. She wished. She asked when would be convenient, and he said he would send a note to Purcell that afternoon and let her know through Mrs. Calloway, since he knew Martha and could reach her easily. Louise thanked him, and this time when she turned to leave he came around the counter just slightly, as if he had started to do something and then thought better of it, and he said, "Mrs. Holloway, for what it is worth, what your husband found is real. The North Canyon vein is real. He was right." She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the frame, not looking at him, looking at the street outside. "Thank you," she said. "That matters." And then she went out, and the bell rang, and Cecil Norris stood in the middle of his shop with his hands at his sides, and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, which was the particular ache of wanting to help someone in a way that went beyond the professional and the practical. He was sensible enough to recognize it. He was also sensible enough to do nothing about it for the time being, because she was 6 weeks widowed, and she had enough to manage without him adding to it. He sat down, pulled the ledger toward him, and went back to work. The introduction to Frank Purcell came through 2 days later, arranged over a brief meeting at the hotel dining room which Cecil had suggested as neutral ground, and which was, as a result, considerably more comfortable than either of the alternatives, which were the assay office, which was too much on Cecil's territory, or Calloway's, which was too much on Louise's. Purcell was a compact, energetic man of about 45 with a silver-streaked mustache and the look of a man who had spent most of his life in mountain wind, and he knew the North Canyon geology well, having surveyed adjacent properties the previous summer. He looked at Thomas's map and Cecil's assay results and the notes Louise had brought, and within 20 minutes he had told her what she needed to know about development costs and likely production timelines, with a directness and competence that she appreciated. He also told her something neither she nor Cecil had known, which was that there was a second claim recently staked in the North Canyon, not adjacent to hers but close enough to be relevant, by a man he knew was working as a proxy for Nevada Consolidated, and that the company's surveyors had been on the ridge above her claim site within the last month. "They know what's there," Purcell said, with the flat certainty of a man who had watched this happen before, "or they suspect strongly enough to be moving. If you're going to negotiate a sale, Mrs. Holloway, my advice is sooner rather than later and not to Aldrich directly. Go over his head, right to the San Francisco office." Cecil had been sitting quietly through the meeting, taking no notes and making no contributions, but at this he said, "Or don't sell. If the vein is what the assay suggests, the royalty route gives you a better long-term return." Purcell shrugged. "True, if you can hold out long enough and keep the claim documentation in order and keep the lawyers away." Louise looked from one man to the other. She said, "I can hold out. What I need is to make sure I understand the claim documentation properly and to get a second assay done from a different site on the vein." Both men looked at her with the same expression, which was the expression of men who have underestimated someone and just been corrected. "That," Cecil said, "is exactly the right next step." Over the following 2 weeks, a rhythm developed that none of the 3 people involved quite noticed they were settling into. Louise went out to the North Canyon claim with Purcell twice, accompanied by a laborer Purcell hired for the purpose, and they took samples from 3 different sites along the exposed vein face. She brought those samples to Cecil, and Cecil ran his assays with meticulous care and gave her the results in written form and talked her through the implications. The numbers across all 3 sites were consistent. The vein was real, and it was substantial, and it ran deep. In between the technical discussions, other things got said. Not many things and not dramatic things, but things nonetheless. Cecil mentioned Philadelphia once, in response to something she asked about his training, and described it with the careful detachment of a man who had left a place behind him for reasons he did not particularly want to revisit. She did not push. She mentioned Thomas once, not in grief, but in a story about something he had done on their first winter in Nevada, a misadventure with a wagon axle in a snowstorm that had ended with them spending an unplanned night in a shepherd's empty cabin. And she told the story with a warmth that made Cecil laugh, and the laugh surprised him enough that he stopped and looked at the counter for a moment. It was Martha Calloway who said it first, because Martha Calloway always said things first. She said it over the mending on a Wednesday evening when Louise had come home from an afternoon at the assay office with the second set of results, and she said it without looking up from her work, in the tone of someone making an observation about the weather. "Cecil Norris," Martha said, "was married once, before he came out here. The wife died in childbirth. The baby, too. He came west the following year and never spoke of it. Louise kept her needle moving. "That is a terrible thing," she said. "It is," Martha agreed. "Left him very careful about everything, not cold, just careful." Louise said nothing. "He watches you," Martha said, still not looking up. "When you come in. I was in the shop last week picking up my cousin's sample results and I saw it." "Martha," Louise said. "I am just telling you what I see," Martha said serenely. "My eyes are still good." Louise did not say anything further on the subject that night, but she lay awake for a while after and thought about careful men, and about the look on Cecil's face when she had said the result mattered, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that she was thinking about it more than she needed to if it were purely informational. It was the third week in April when things at the claims became more pressured. A man named Donaldson, who turned out to be a lawyer working for Nevada Consolidated, arrived in town and called on Louise at Callaway's with a revised offer of $1,200 for the main claim only. The number was 3 times what Aldrich had offered, which meant they had done their own assessment and confirmed what Cecil's assay had shown, and Louise kept her expression neutral and told Donaldson she would think about it. And after he left, she walked directly to the assay office. Cecil was in the workroom when she arrived and came out wiping his hands on a cloth, and he took one look at her face and said, "What's happened?" she told him. He listened and then he said, 1,200, they've confirmed the vein. That's what I thought. It's still a fraction of what the royalty rights would return you over a 5-year production period, he said, even on a conservative estimate. I know. She set her hands flat on the counter. "Mr. Norris, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Always," he said, and the word was so immediate and certain that she felt it as a kind of steadiness. "Do you believe the vein will produce consistently enough to make holding out for a royalty arrangement worth the risk of waiting? Not in technical terms, I understand the technical terms. I mean in your judgment, your actual judgment." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter and then he looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I do. The formation is consistent with a deep primary vein, not a secondary enrichment zone that pinches out. It will produce." "I could be wrong, but I believe I'm not." "Good enough," she said. "Then I am going to decline Donaldson." She did. She sent a note that evening and declined politely and without explanation, and the following day Donaldson called again and raised the offer to 1,800, and she declined again, and he went away looking annoyed, and Purcell, who had heard about it from Louise, stopped by the assay office to tell Cecil, and they stood in the shop and Purcell said, "She's got iron in her spine, that woman." "Yes," Cecil said simply, in a tone that made Purcell look at him with a slight squint. That evening, Cecil closed the office at his usual time, and instead of going directly to the hotel, he found himself walking south down the main street toward Callaway's, which was not his usual route to anywhere. He got as far as the front gate, which was a low wooden thing with a latch that had rusted open, and he stood there for a moment looking at the porch where the lamp was burning, and then he turned around and went back the way he had come, because it was the wrong time and he knew it. But the thing was there now, inside him, named or as good as named, and it was not going away. It was a clear Saturday afternoon in early May when it finally shifted. Louise had come to the office not on business, or not purely on business, because she had brought back a set of documents that needed to be filed, and that Cecil had agreed to look over. But she had also, she knew, come because she had been thinking about him all morning in a way that was no longer possible to attribute entirely to the claims. She found him outside the office, which was unusual, sitting on the top step of the stoop eating an apple and reading a letter, having apparently just collected his post from the general store. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. He was in his shirt without the apron, his spectacles pushed up on his forehead the way he sometimes wore them when he was not looking at anything close up, and the afternoon light was sharp and golden on the street, and she stopped a few feet from the stoop because the image of him sitting there in the ordinary afternoon was so unexpectedly, unreasonably pleasant that she needed a second to compose herself. "Good afternoon," he said. He put the letter in his shirt pocket and stood up and offered her the step, which she declined, and they ended up both standing on the stoop in the afternoon light, which was warm for May and smelled of new sage and distant rain somewhere over the mountains. She gave him the documents and he looked through them and made a few comments, small corrections of language in the filing descriptions that could matter legally, and she wrote the corrections in the margins. And then she said, because it was the day and the light and the warmth and the tiredness of being alone, "May I ask you something personal?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said, the same immediacy as before. "Do you like it here?" she asked. "In Redrock, do you like this life?" It was not the question he had been expecting, and his expression told her so, but he considered it genuinely. "I like the work," he said. "I like knowing things. I like that rock tells the truth if you ask it the right way. The town is rough, but it's honest in its roughness, which I prefer to places that pretend otherwise." He paused. "I am solitary by nature. I was more so before I came here than I am now." "What changed?" He looked at the mountains. "I suppose I stopped expecting nothing," he said. "That took a while." She understood what he meant by that, and the understanding settled between them like something solid and warm, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I think Thomas would have liked you," she said. She was not sure why she said it except that it was true and it needed to be said. Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I think he found something remarkable out there," he said, meaning the canyon, meaning the vein, but his voice made her understand he was not entirely talking about the ore. She laughed, a small surprised sound. She had not expected him to be quick that way. He smiled, and the smile was the fullest she had seen from him, which made it more worth seeing. "I meant the geology," he said. "You did not," she said. "No," he said. "I did not entirely." They stood there in the afternoon light for another few minutes, talking about nothing in particular, which was to say talking about everything that mattered. And when she finally left, he watched her go down the street and thought that 3 years of careful solitude might be coming to the end of their useful purpose. Donaldson came back in mid-May with a man named Calder who introduced himself as a senior vice president of Nevada, consolidated, and offered $4,000 for the main claim outright, which Louise declined. Calder was not like Aldrich or Donaldson. He was a big man from San Francisco who had built a piece of his fortune by understanding when to be patient and when to press, and he looked at Louise with something like genuine respect and said, "Mrs. Holloway, I think we are both aware that you are holding a valuable property. I would like to propose a royalty arrangement." Louise, who had known this offer was coming since the day she turned down $1,800, sat across from Calder in the hotel dining room and said, "Tell me the terms." The terms were not good enough. She said so, politely and specifically, citing the assay values and the vein estimates Purcell had done, and the production numbers from comparable mines in the region, all of which she had prepared the previous evening at Calloway's by lamplight with a notebook and a pen and considerable determination. Calder listened with visible surprise, which gave her quiet satisfaction, and they negotiated for 2 hours. At the end of it, they had not reached an agreement, but they were close enough that Louise felt the ground under her feet had become considerably firmer. She stopped at the assay office on the way home. Cecil was there, and she told him what had happened, and he listened, and when she told him the terms she had held out for, he said, "That is better than I expected." "I did my reading," she said. "You did," he agreed, and the admiration in his tone was unambiguous. She looked at him across the counter. She said, "I am going to need someone I trust to look over the final contract when we reach it, someone who understands the technical valuation." "I'll look at it," he said. "I was going to ask," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to offer." A pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that happens between two people who have said something that means more than the words. "Cecil," she said. She had started using his first name some days back, at some point so naturally that neither of them had marked when it began. "I would like to take supper with you sometime, not to discuss the contract." He had pushed his spectacles up on his forehead again the way he did, and he was looking at her with an expression that was serious and warm simultaneously, which was very much his particular expression. "I would like that very much," he said. "Tomorrow evening." "Tomorrow evening," she agreed. That supper, at the hotel dining room because it was the most civil establishment in Redrock for such a purpose, lasted 3 hours. They ate roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and apple cake that was better than it had any right to be. And they talked about things they had not yet talked about, which included Philadelphia and what had happened there, which Cecil told her about in measured, honest terms without dwelling in the pain of it but not skipping past it either, and the homestead out on the flat, which Louise described with the same honest balance, the hard years and the good ones. The marriage that had been a true partnership even when it was difficult, the loss that had left a silence she was still learning the shape of. Cecil listened the way he did everything with his full attention, and he did not rush her, and he did not fill silences he did not need to fill. And at some point during the apple cake, Louise realized that the peculiar ache she had been carrying for 3 months, the constant low-grade pressure of grief and uncertainty and the effort of managing things alone, had lightened somewhat in the course of the evening, not disappeared, not remedied, but lightened in the way that things do when you finally sit in the company of someone who does not require you to be any particular way. She said as much, though not in those words exactly. She said that it had been a long time since she had sat at a table and not been thinking about what she needed to do next, and he said that he understood that, and he said it in a way that showed he meant it from his own experience. They walked back down the main street in the dark, which was lit by the lanterns outside the Copper Crown and the hotel and the general store, and when they reached the corner where Calloway's Lane diverged from the main street, they stopped. The night was warm, and the sky was dense with stars in the way that Nevada sky was in those years before the world lit up, and a coyote was howling somewhere out past the south edge of town. "Thank you," Louise said. "Thank you," he said. He meant it differently than she did, and they both knew it. He walked her to Calloway's gate. He did not take her hand, not that evening, because it was too soon and he was careful and she appreciated both facts. But he said good night in a tone that held something more substantial than courtesy, and she said good night in the same key. And she went inside and sat in her room for a long time with the lamp lit, and a small, astonishing lightness in her chest that she was not yet ready to name, but was not going to pretend she could not feel. Through May and into June, the negotiations with Nevada consolidated ground forward, with the slowness of all legal and financial matters, in a territory where every document had to travel to San Francisco for senior review. Louise made 2 more trips to the North Canyon with Purcell, and Cecil reviewed the additional assay samples, and the results remained consistently strong. She also dealt with Donaldson's periodic attempts to revisit earlier terms that she had already declined, which she did with a patience that did not go unrewarded. Meanwhile, something else was growing, more quietly and more steadily than the negotiations, and it was growing in both of them simultaneously, which was perhaps why neither of them stumbled in it or tried to rush it. They had supper twice more in the hotel dining room, and once, on a Sunday when the office was closed, Cecil showed her something he had not shown another person in Redrock, which was a collection of geological samples he had assembled from across the region over 3 years, organized in a wooden case he had built himself, each piece labeled in his clean, precise hand. He walked her through them in the back room of the assay office with the afternoon light coming through the single high window, telling her about each piece, the formations they came from, what they told him about the history of the land, and his voice was different when he talked about this than when he talked about anything else, warmer and less guarded, and she stood close enough to look at the samples and listen to his voice and thought about what Martha had said about careful men. After, they sat in the 2 chairs he had in the back room and drank coffee that was too strong in the way his coffee always was, and talked. He told her about something he had been working on, a more detailed geological survey of the North Canyon Formation that he had started on his own time, because he found the formation interesting and that he thought might, eventually, be worth publishing in a mining journal. She asked questions that showed she had been paying attention for months, and he answered them with a seriousness that acknowledged she was a real conversational partner, not someone to be talked at. At some point in the afternoon, he reached across the small table between them and put his hand over hers, briefly, as if to make a point in the conversation, and then did not move it. She did not move either. The afternoon light came through the high window and made a white square on the floorboards, and outside the wind was picking up and carrying the smell of rain, and they sat that way for several minutes without speaking, and it was, Louise thought, one of the quieter and more complete moments she had experienced in a long time. "Louise," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't said anything yet." "No," she agreed, "but I know." She turned her hand so that it was holding his rather than being held by it. "I know," he exhaled slowly. "I want to be sure I am not. I want to be sure this is the right time. For you." She looked at their hands. She thought about Thomas, not with guilt but with the kind of honesty she had always tried to bring to the things that mattered. Thomas had been real and her grief was real, and it was also true that she was alive, and she was 31 years old, and she was sitting in a small room in Nevada with a man who made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like the future was a thing worth paying attention to. "Cecil," she said, "it is not too soon if neither of us is pretending it is something it is not." "And I am not pretending." He looked at her for a long moment. "Neither am I," he said. It began properly then, in the gentle, undemonstrative way of two people who had both been hurt and both learned the value of care. They were not reckless about it and they were not cold about it. They were, as they were about most things, thorough. The contract with Nevada Consolidated was finalized on the 14th of June, 1879. It was a royalty arrangement on the main claim, 12% of net smelter returns, with a minimum guaranteed payment structure that Calder had taken 2 rounds of negotiation to agree to, and which Purcell told Louise, in private and in his professional opinion, was better than anything he had seen Nevada Consolidated offer a private holder in the past 3 years. Cecil had reviewed the final language and recommended 3 small changes, which Donaldson had accepted, and the document was signed in the land office with Louise's signature clear and firm at the bottom of the page. She was not rich. She was not immediately comfortable. The royalty payments would build over time as the mine developed and production began, which Purcell estimated would take 6 to 8 months at the current pace of Nevada Consolidated's development. But the guaranteed minimum was enough to provide her a stable income beginning in the fall. And the upside was, if the vein continued to produce, as the assay evidence suggested it would, very substantial. She sold the other 2 claims at a reasonable price to a smaller operator named Cabot who was developing adjacent property. And with that combined with the contract guarantees, she had a foundation under her feet that she had not had since Thomas died. That evening after the signing, she went to the assay office. Cecil had been in the shop all day and had not attended the signing, because it was not his place to attend and he had known that and stayed away. But he had been thinking about it all day, and when the bell over the door rang at 5 in the afternoon and he looked up and saw her face, he knew from her expression exactly how it had gone. She came to the counter and set her hands on it and looked at him. "It's done," she said. He came around the counter, and she had not seen him come around the counter before, not all the way, not out from behind it, and he was close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the faint stain of silver nitrate on his left index finger that never fully washed out. He said nothing. He simply took her hands in both of his, carefully, in the way he did everything, and she felt the steadiness of his grip and the warmth of it, and she thought, there it is. "You did it," he said. "We did some of it," she said. "You did the important parts," he insisted, and his voice was low and warm and completely certain. They went to supper that evening, and it was different from the other suppers because the business was settled now and the conversation was only ever going to be itself. Just two people, and somewhere between the main course and the apple cake, which had become their shared preference for reasons neither could explain, he said quietly, "I do not want this to be the end of your reasons to come to Redrock." She set down her fork. She looked at him. "Cecil," she said, "I came to Redrock for one reason and I have stayed for a different one. I think you know that." The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened. "I would like to know it with rather more certainty," he said. "Then be certain," she told him, and the color rose slightly in his face in a way she found extremely gratifying. He proposed to her properly 1 month later, on a Sunday morning when the desert was still cool, and they had ridden out together on horses they had borrowed from the livery at the edge of town, riding north along the base of the canyon wall in the long early light. It was one of those Nevada mornings that arrived as if the world had been rebuilt overnight, everything clear and still and precisely itself, the sage silver green and the rock face red and gold above them, and the horses moved at an easy walk along the canyon floor. He stopped his horse at a point where the canyon opened into a wider space, and she stopped beside him, and he said, without preamble, which she had come to understand was entirely his style, "I want to marry you, Louise. I want you to be here with me in this place, if this place is where you want to be. I know it is not Philadelphia. I know it is not what you might have chosen at a different time, but I am asking you to choose it now with me." She looked at the canyon walls and the sky above them, which was the blue of early morning, and she looked at him on his horse in the early light, his hat pushed back, and his spectacles on properly for once, watching her with that steady, careful look. And she thought about all the things she had not expected when she walked into the assay office with a leather pouch and her dead husband's sample. And she thought about the way a person's life could turn on a single moment that seemed small while it was happening. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, and she said it simply, and she meant it entirely. He reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand, and they sat that way for a while in the canyon, looking at the place where Thomas Holloway had found his vein, which was now producing silver under the skilled hands of Nevada Consolidated's development crew. And the royalty payments had already begun, and Louise had opened an account at the Redrock Bank, and the balance was growing with a reassuring regularity. They were married in September of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Protestant church on the hill above Redrock, which was a modest building with a good bell and a congregation that had grown with the town, and included, by this point, a fair number of people who knew both of them well. Martha Calloway was there, and cried with visible satisfaction. Frank Purcell was there and shook Cecil's hand with the sincerity of a man who had watched the whole thing develop from a professional distance and approved of the conclusion. The hotel dining room hosted a supper afterward that had roasted chicken and, at Louise's insistence, apple cake, and the evening was warm and the music was a fiddle and a mouth organ, and the dancing went on until well past midnight. They moved into a house on the east end of Redrock that Cecil had been renting for a year, but had not done much to make habitable, and which Louise set about making into something more than a place to sleep with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She hung curtains in the front room and put down a rug and arranged the kitchen properly, and made space on the bookshelves for her own books alongside Cecil's, which were predominantly mineralogy and chemistry and survey reports, but also included, to her warm surprise, a worn copy of Dickens and 2 volumes of natural history essays that she liked immediately. Cecil's practice at the assay office continued steadily, and if anything it grew in the months after the marriage, because word spread in Boomtown's faster than any advertisement, and his reputation for thoroughness and honesty drew clients from a broader area. Louise did not sit idle. She had the mining business to manage, because the royalty arrangements required attention, accounting, and periodic correspondence with Nevada Consolidated's representatives in San Francisco, which she handled with a brisk efficiency that impressed Purcell and baffled Donaldson, who had apparently not anticipated she would become a businesswoman of any competence. She also began, in the winter, to assist Cecil with the ledger and correspondence side of the assay office, which freed him for the technical work, and which she found she enjoyed, having always had a head for numbers and organization. The winter of 1879 going into 1880 was cold and quiet and comfortable, which was not a word Louise had applied to many stretches of her life. They fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that sometimes surprised her when she stopped to notice it, the way two people who had both been alone for a while could slot together without friction, because they had both learned to be deliberate, to say what they meant, to ask rather than assume. They were not always easy with each other. Cecil had a habit of disappearing into his work in a way that required a certain patience, and Louise had a temper that she kept well managed, but that was there, and there were evenings that ended in silence and nights that required the repair of mornings, as all honest shared lives do. But the foundation was sound. It had been built on honesty and knowledge rather than urgency, and it held. She was pregnant by February of 1880. She told him on a Sunday morning when the snow was coming down outside the kitchen window in slow, thick flakes, and the stove was warm and the coffee was ready, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with a section of ore sample and a magnifying lens, which was a typical Sunday morning. She sat down across from him and said, "Cecil, I need to tell you something." He set down the lens. He looked at her. The careful expression was there, and beneath it, the moment she said it, something that broke open in a way that was not careful at all. He was around the table and had both arms around her before she had quite finished speaking, which was entirely unlike him and entirely right. He held her for a long time without saying anything, which was its own kind of saying, and she felt him breathe, and she felt the tension in him that she had not realized he was carrying, the old grief and the old fear, releasing like a spring unwinding, and she held him just as tightly. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Terrified," he said into her hair, and the honesty of it made her love him very much. "So am I," she said. "We'll manage." "We'll manage," he agreed, and she could feel that he meant it. The spring of 1880 came in with warmth and new sage, and the return of the road traffic that slowed in the deep winter, and Redrock expanded another notch further along the canyon road, as the Nevada Consolidated Development brought more workers and their families, and the businesses that followed workers. The assay office took on a part-time employee, a young man named Everett who was 17 and recently arrived from Colorado, and had a natural aptitude for the work that Cecil recognized and set about teaching properly. Louise's management of the business side steadied considerably once Everett was there to handle the more routine aspects of the technical work, freeing Cecil from the overlap. The royalty payments from the main claim, by mid-1880, had grown to a point where Louise's financial position was not merely stable, but genuinely comfortable for the first time since she had married Thomas, which Thomas would have found deeply satisfying, she thought. She said so to Cecil once, on the porch of the house on a warm evening, and he said that he thought so too, and there was nothing morbid in the saying of it, just the honest acknowledgement of a man they both, in their different ways, owed something to. Their son was born in October of 1880, on a clear cold morning when the first frost was on the ground, and the sky was the color of the inside of a copper bowl, which Louise noted privately as appropriate. Cecil was there, which was not always the custom in those years, but was the only thing he had been certain about in the preceding 8 months, that he was going to be there, and he was. The birth was long and difficult enough that the doctor was glad he had come, and the doctor made sure Cecil understood that Louise had handled it with a composure that was entirely characteristic of her. Cecil, who had waited in the hall for the worst of it and been allowed into the room for the end of it, stood by the bed and looked at his wife and his son with the particular stunned gratitude of a man who had decided a long time ago that certain things were not going to be possible for him, and had just been shown in the most complete possible way that he had been wrong. They named him Thomas Cecil Norris. Thomas for the man who had found the vein, and Cecil for the man who had known what it was worth, which was not a small thing to ask a man to carry in his name, but the boy in question seemed, from the first hours of his life, to be entirely up to it. He was a solid, interested baby, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, who from very early on seemed to observe the world with an attentiveness that made Cecil privately and delightedly certain that he would become either a scientist or a criminal mastermind. He grew with the steadiness and energy of a child who is loved and well-fed and provided with constant interesting things to look at, and the house on the east end of Redrock became, as the months went on, a genuinely cheerful place, which it had not been before, which had been a good and orderly place but not a cheerful one. Martha Calloway was at the house every Sunday for supper, having been absorbed into the family in the way that certain kind and competent people are absorbed by the lives they help to build. Frank Purcell called every few weeks on business and stayed for a meal when invited. Everett, who had become something between an apprentice and a younger brother at the assay office, was a frequent presence and had the unaffected devotion to baby Thomas that young men sometimes develop unexpectedly. In the spring of 1881, something happened at the North Canyon claim that required attention. The Nevada Consolidated Operation had opened a second tunnel following a lateral branch of the vein, and the ore coming out of the new tunnel was of a grade that was even higher than the original, which according to the contract terms entitled Louise to a renegotiation of the royalty rate. Donaldson, who was still the company's representative, arrived with revised terms that were marginally better but not good enough, and Louise, who had spent a year and a half running the financial side of an assay business and reviewing mining contracts, engaged the negotiation with a fluency that was considerably more formidable than her 1879 self had yet developed. Cecil sat in on this negotiation, which was held in the hotel dining room, and said almost nothing, because Louise did not need him to say anything, but his presence there, steady and informed, was not nothing. At one point Donaldson made an argument about market rates that was technically incorrect in a way that required a specialist to catch, and Cecil said simply, "That figure is based on mill assay data from properties with a different sulfide matrix. The applicable comparison is the Virginia City complex, where the rate structure looks like this," and he cited a number that closed the argument with surgical efficiency. Donaldson looked at them both. Louise said pleasantly, "Shall we continue?" The renegotiated contract was better. Not as good as it should have been, Louise thought, but better than Donaldson had intended, and Purcell confirmed it was fair. She signed it and sent a copy to San Francisco and filed the original in the land records, and that evening she and Cecil sat on the porch while Thomas slept inside, and the evening was warm and the stars were coming out, and she said, "I keep thinking about that day in the assay office. When I came in with the sample, I think about it too," he said. "You knew," she said, "from the beginning." "I suspected strongly," he said. "I knew when the assay was done." "What did you think?" "When you saw the numbers," he considered. "I thought," he said, "that your husband had found something significant, and then I thought about you, the way you stood at the counter, the way you asked what to do." "I had to ask," she said. "I didn't know." "That is not weakness," he said. "That is clarity. You knew what you knew and you asked about what you didn't. That is rarer than you would think." She leaned her head on his shoulder, which was something she had begun doing in the early months of the marriage and which remained, for reasons she could not fully articulate, the single physical gesture that most completely expressed the way she felt about him. The simplicity of it. The choice to rest. He put his arm around her and they sat on the porch in the Nevada dark and listened to the quiet town around them, the distant sound from the Copper Crown, the coyote call from the south, the creak of the house in the light spring wind. "What do you want?" he said. "For the next while, not the contracts, not the mine. You." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think. "I want Thomas to be healthy and curious and grow up knowing that the work you do matters," she said. "I want the house to be full sometimes. I want more nights like this one." She paused. "I want a daughter eventually or another son. Either way." "That," he said, and his voice was warm and content in a way that she had come to understand was the fullest version of himself, the version that only came out in this particular light with her, "is an entirely reasonable want." "And you?" she said. He looked at the stars for a while. "I want to finish the geological survey of the North Canyon Formation and see if anyone in Philadelphia still thinks I am worth reading," he said. "I want to teach Everett to do the work properly so that he can have a practice of his own someday. I want Thomas to be able to read a rock formation before he is 10 years old, and I want—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "I want this," he said, meaning the porch and the house and the arm around her and the sleeping child inside. "Specifically this. I am not a complicated man." She laughed quietly. "You are the most complicated, simple man I have ever known," she said. "Is that a complaint?" "Not even slightly," she said. The summer of 1881 passed in its fullness, and Thomas Norris began to walk, which he did with the determined carefulness of a child who had watched his father do everything carefully and taken thorough notes. He was a sociable baby who liked people and was not afraid of strangers, which Louise attributed to her side and Cecil accepted with transparent pride. He sat on the counter of the assay office sometimes when Louise brought him, and watched the scale and the instruments with enormous interest, reaching for everything with the focused intent of someone conducting an experiment. Cecil's geological survey was progressing slowly, which was always going to be the case when it was done in the margins of a full professional practice, but it was progressing. He had corresponded with a colleague in Philadelphia, a man named Hartley who was at the Franklin Institute still, and who had published several well-regarded papers on Nevada formation geology. And Hartley had expressed interest in what Cecil was describing, which was more than Cecil had allowed himself to expect, and which pleased him more than he admitted to Louise, until she noticed the look on his face when Hartley's most recent letter arrived, and asked him what it was. He showed her the letter. She read it carefully. "He wants to come see it," she said. "This Hartley. He says he is considering a Western survey," Cecil said. "He might stop here." "Good," she said. "You should show him." "It is just a survey," he said. "Cecil," she said, in the particular tone that meant she was about to tell him a true thing he was not telling himself. "You have been working on it for 2 years in your free time when any other man would have been drinking in the Copper Crown. It is not just a survey." He looked at the letter. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." "Show him," she said. "Invite him to supper. I'll make something that is not the hotel's apple cake." He smiled. "You like the hotel's apple cake? That doesn't mean I can't make something better," she said, which was true. She was an excellent cook, and had been quietly amused by his near devotion to the hotel's apple cake, which she had replicated in the kitchen to his utter delight, using her grandmother's recipe and a great deal of brown sugar. September of 1881 brought Hartley, who was a small, energetic man of 60 with a white beard, and the manner of someone who was in a state of constant mild excitement about the planet's geological history. He arrived on the stage and installed himself at the hotel and spent 3 days in the North Canyon with Cecil and a set of survey instruments. And the conversations that emerged from those 3 days were, from what Louise could observe, the most animated she had ever seen Cecil. He came home on each of those evenings with a new color in his face and a quality of aliveness that reminded her of Thomas describing the canyon by lamplight. And she fed Hartley her grandmother's apple cake and listened to them talk about formation types and secondary mineralization and regional tectonic patterns, and understood roughly a third of it, and found the rest delightful anyway, because of the way Cecil's hands moved when he talked about things that mattered. Hartley left on the 4th day with a copy of Cecil's survey notes and a standing invitation to publish jointly, which Cecil accepted with a careful understatement that clearly required some effort. After Hartley's stage departed, Cecil stood in the street for a moment with his hat in his hands, and Louise was beside him, holding Thomas on her hip, and she said, "Well." He turned to look at her. The morning was cool and bright, and the town was going about its business around them, and Cecil Norris stood in the street in Redrock, Nevada, in the autumn of 1881 with his hat in his hands and the slight stunned expression of a man whose work has just been seen by someone qualified to see it, and Louise watched it and felt a joy for him that was entirely clean and completely genuine. "Well," he said. "He is going to publish it," she said, "with your name on it." "He thinks it is worth publishing," Cecil said, as if this were still slightly improbable. "I have been telling you that for 2 years," she said. "You do not have Hartley's credentials," he said. "No," she agreed pleasantly. "I have better judgment." He took Thomas from her arms, which the boy accepted with his usual equanimity, and looked at his son in the autumn light and then at his wife and said, "I want you to know that I understand I am very fortunate." "We are both fortunate," she said. "And we both worked for it." "Not equally," he said. "You came in with a leather pouch and a dead man's map, and you refused to be bought out, and you held your ground, and you built something." "You told me the truth," she said, "when the truth was worth a great deal more than $400, and you had no obligation to tell me how much it was worth. You could have told me it was a middling sample and watched me take Aldrich's money." His expression sharpened. "That would have been I would not have." "I know," she said. "That is my point." He looked at her for a long moment, and Thomas patted his cheek with a deliberate small hand, and Cecil caught the hand and held it gently, and the street of Redrock went about its usual Saturday morning business around the three of them, horses and wagons and the sound of the hardware store sweeping its front step, and the smell of autumn sage coming down from the canyon. "I want to go to Philadelphia," he said, which was not what she had expected him to say. "Not permanently. For a month or two, with the survey, with you, to see Hartley and the Institute," and he stopped. "You have never seen a city." "I grew up in Indiana," she said. "I have seen cities." "Not Philadelphia," he said. She considered. Thomas was looking at a passing horse with the concentrated interest of a child collecting information. The mine was running well. The office could manage for 2 months with Everett, who was capable and responsible and 19 now and the best young Assyr in the region by a considerable margin. Martha Calloway would water the house plants. The November stage connected to the railroad at Carson City. "When?" she said. "Spring," he said. "When Thomas is walking steadily and before the next one arrives." She looked at him. "You are very certain about the next one." "I am hopeful," he said carefully. "Hopeful is good," she agreed. "Spring, then." They went in April of 1882, all three of them, on the stage to Carson City, and then the Central Pacific East, which was the first time either Cecil or Thomas had been on a train together, and the first time Louise had been on one since coming west with Thomas Holloway 12 years before. Thomas the younger was fascinated by the train with an intensity that required both parents to monitor simultaneously, and the journey was long and occasionally exhausting, and also, genuinely, one of the pleasures of Louise's life. She looked out the window at the changing landscape, the desert giving way to the mountains, and then the long descent toward the east, and she thought about the woman who had gone west on a train like this one a dozen years ago, young and somewhat frightened and full of the ordinary hope of youth, and she thought about the woman who was sitting in the same direction now, older and fuller, and carrying a knowledge of herself and the world that had been bought at some cost, and was therefore genuinely hers. Cecil sat beside her with a sleeping Thomas in his arms and a book open on his knee that he was not reading, and she could tell from the shape of his attention that he was thinking, doing what he always did in silence, which was work something through with methodical care. She let him be. After a while he said, without turning from the window, "I was afraid to come back." "I know," she said. "Not of the city," he said, "of what I left there." "But you came," she said. "You suggested it," he said. "You wanted to," she said, "or you wouldn't have mentioned it." He turned to look at her, the familiar, steady look. "You know me very well." 3 years is a start, she said. Philadelphia was everything Cecil had described, and some things he hadn't. A city that smelled of coal and river water and baking bread, and the peculiar urban density of thousands of people living their lives in close proximity, which was so different from Redrock that Louise stood on the street outside the station for a moment and simply breathed it in. It was not better or worse than Nevada. It was different in ways that were interesting rather than threatening, and she moved through it with the same clear-eyed attention she brought to everything. Cecil took her to the Franklin Institute, which smelled of old wood and chemicals and the dry, dusty smell of knowledge preserved, and introduced her to Hartley and 3 other colleagues who had known Cecil before he left, and who regarded him now with the respect due a man who had gone somewhere difficult and done something worth doing there. Louise shook their hands and answered their questions about the North Canyon Formation with a directness and accuracy that produced visible surprise and then visible respect. And Hartley pulled Cecil aside at one point and said something that Cecil reported to Louise later that evening in the hotel room, which was that Hartley had said she was the most informed mining property owner he had encountered outside of a professional engineering background. He said it as if it were remarkable, Cecil said, with a slight edge in his tone that was not directed at Louise. It is not remarkable, Louise said. No, he agreed. It is not. The month in Philadelphia was good in ways that were complex and difficult to summarize. Cecil visited the grave of his wife and child, which was the thing he had been afraid to do, and which he did on a Tuesday morning alone while Louise stayed at the hotel with Thomas, and he came back in the afternoon looking wrung out but steadier, and she did not ask him about it but took his hand when he sat down, and they sat together until Thomas woke from his nap and resumed his enthusiastic investigation of the hotel room's curtain tassels. They went to the theater twice, which Louise found extraordinary, and to a concert of chamber music which Cecil loved with the same quiet intensity he brought to good geological formations, and to a fine restaurant where the food was better than anything in Redrock by a considerable margin, and Thomas ate bread with systematic thoroughness. They walked along the river in the evenings, and she told him about Indiana, about her parents who were gone now, about the way she had imagined her life before she lived it, and he listened the way he always did, completely. They went home in May, back on the train through the long American West, watching the landscape change in reverse, the east becoming the mountains, becoming the desert. And when the stage pulled into Redrock on a warm afternoon in the second week of May, the town looked smaller than she remembered, but also unmistakably like home, like the place where her life had organized itself into the shape it was going to have. And she stepped down from the stage and smelled sage and dry heat and the faint copper smell from the smelter east of town, and felt the particular relief of arriving somewhere that knew you. Everett had kept the office running impeccably. Martha Calloway's vegetable garden was thriving. The mine was producing well. Everything was exactly as they had left it, and also because they were home from somewhere that had been important, slightly more itself than before. In the fall of 1882, their daughter was born. She was smaller than Thomas had been, and louder from the first moment, and had her father's gray eyes and an expression of informed skepticism that Louise recognized as something she herself had apparently passed on. They named her Margaret Holloway Norris, the middle name for Thomas Holloway, in the same honest, generous spirit as Thomas the son, because the line from that leather pouch and that first sample to this girl's existence was a real one, however indirect, and it deserved to be honored. Cecil held Margaret in the hours after her birth with the same overwhelmed, careful tenderness he had brought to Thomas, but steadier now, less terrified, more simply present, and Louise watched him from the bed and thought that this was what she had wanted when she had said she wanted the house to be full sometimes. This exact thing. The man she had chosen standing in the good lamplight of the house they had made together with their second child in his arms, the weight of it in his face not as burden but as gift. Thomas, aged 2, was brought in to meet his sister by Martha Calloway and regarded her with the concentrated attention of a scientist encountering a new specimen, then looked at his father and said with authority, "Mine." "Ours," Cecil said, and the correction was gentle and completely precise. The years settled. Redrock continued to grow through the mid-1880s, and the assay office grew with it, and the North Canyon mine produced through its productive years and then began, as all mines do, to thin out. And by 1887, the royalty payments were smaller but still meaningful, and Louise had managed them carefully enough that the Norris family was, by the standards of the time and place, comfortable and secure in a way that had been built rather than inherited. Cecil's survey paper was published in the American Journal of Mining and Metallurgy in 1883 under both his name and Hartley's, and it was well received enough to generate correspondence from other assayers and geologists across the West, some of whom made their way to Redrock to discuss the North Canyon formation with him. He wrote 2 more papers after that, both independently, and if he never returned to the academic world he had left in Philadelphia, he carried the work of it forward in a way that was honest to who he was, a working scientist in a working town, doing the work for the love of the knowledge and the use of it to real people in real circumstances. Everett eventually opened his own assay office in a town 20 miles north, which Cecil had always planned for, and which he attended with the particular pride of a man who has made someone else more capable. They stayed in close correspondence, and Everett sent clients Cecil's way when the more complex work required it, which it often did, and the professional friendship between them was one of the genuine pleasures of Cecil's later working life. Thomas grew up in the assay office and the North Canyon and the house on the east end of Redrock, and he did, as Cecil had privately hoped, develop the ability to read a rock formation by the time he was 10, which Louise acknowledged by presenting Cecil with a look of comprehensive "I told you so" that required no words. Thomas became, in time, a mining engineer, studying in San Francisco and coming home in the summers with his pockets full of samples from wherever he had been that semester, which Cecil assessed with the meticulous care he brought to everything and the particular warmth he brought to this, and the conversations between them over the workbench in the assay office on summer evenings, father and son with their heads bent over rock and lens and lamp, were among the things Louise kept in the private treasury of her happiest memories. Margaret was, as she had been from her first day, her own particular person, with her mother's stubbornness and her father's precision, and a fierceness about justice that expressed itself early and consistently. She was 11 when she told Cecil in exact and accurate terms why the terms a mining company was offering a neighboring widow for her property were inadequate, citing the comparable Nevada consolidated royalty structure that she had apparently memorized from the documents she had observed being filed in the office over her short lifetime. Cecil had listened to the argument with a straight face that Louise, watching from the doorway, could see required some effort, and then said, "You are entirely correct. What would you propose?" And the conversation that followed lasted an hour and ended with Margaret having drafted in her 11-year-old hand a counterproposal that was, Purcell said when shown it later, not bad at all. Louise was 43 in 1891, when she sat on the porch of the house on the east end of Redrock on a September evening with Cecil beside her, and Thomas was 11 years gone to San Francisco for his engineering degree, and had written to say he would be coming home for Christmas with a young woman he wanted them to meet. And Margaret was in the house behind them finishing her homework with the focused fury of a girl who intended to finish everything she started. And the mine in the North Canyon was running quietly on its last years of production, and the assay office was lit up with Everett's young replacement working late on a commission, and the evening was warm and the stars were coming. "Out over Nevada, I have been thinking," Louise said, "about the day I came into the office." "You think about that often," he said, not as an accusation, as a gentle observation. I think about the woman I was then, she said. She did not know what she was going to do. She did not know anything except that the sample was real and she was going to find out what it was worth. She knew more than she thought, Cecil said. She knew to ask the right person, Louise said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had done 1,000 times since that afternoon in the back room of the assay office with the samples in their wooden case, and the coffee too strong, and the afternoon light making its white square on the floorboards. The steadiness of his grip was exactly what it had always been. This was one of the things about him that she had come to think of as fundamental, not the things he said, which were always measured and precise, but the physical fact of his steadiness, the way he was always there when he said he would be, the way his hand was always exactly what it was. "Cecil," she said. "Louise," he said. "I am very glad I walked into that office." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, which was a thing he did rarely enough that each time it had its full weight. Then he held it against his chest, against his shirt, where she could feel his heartbeat under her fingers, steady as everything about him. "I knew what you were worth," he said, meaning the sample, meaning what the sample had led to, meaning all of it. "You knew what the ore was worth," she said. "Both," he said. "I knew about the ore in the first 30 seconds. She looked at him. "And the rest?" "That," he said, "took approximately the same 30 seconds if I am being honest." She laughed, the real laugh, the one that he had first heard on the porch of the assay office on a Saturday afternoon and had been, though he had not admitted it then, a sound that reorganized something in him permanently. "You were very careful," she said. "You were 6 weeks widowed," he said. "I was careful because it was right to be careful, not because I was uncertain." The stars were fully out now. The coyote was somewhere in the south again, the same voice or a descendant of the same voice, calling into the warm Nevada dark. Margaret's lamp went out in the back room, which meant she had finished her work and was reading, which meant she would be at it another 2 hours before she slept. Thomas's letter was on the kitchen table, the handwriting so like Cecil's that it still made Louise pause, that small shock of transmission. "We should go in," Louise said, without moving. "We should," Cecil agreed, without moving. They sat on the porch of the house they had built together in the town that had built itself around a canyon where the vein ran deep, and the night was full and warm around them, and the life they had made from a leather pouch and a dead man's sample, and a man who had known exactly what it was worth was complete in every way that mattered, with all its jagged places and all its fullness, a thing that was genuinely, entirely, and unreservedly theirs.